Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you to this, our first virtual summer lecture at St Hugh's College here in Oxford. I'm delighted to welcome you from all around the planet. There are 300 of you out there, many of whom I know very, very well. So to those of you who I know, it's wonderful to be able to communicate at all with you, and I welcome you back again to college as soon as possible. For those of you I haven't met before, I'm Ailish Angelini, the principal of the college, and I'm thrilled to be able to have an opportunity to be in contact with you and hope that you will also come to visit us in the college as soon as you can. I'm very sorry we can't be together, and I appreciate some of you are eating your breakfast, and as I said last week in a similar event, some of you will also be having midnight snacks, but it's wonderful to have this wonderful worldwide community of St Hugh's alumni here today. It has been an incredibly difficult time, an incredibly sad time for many of you. I know many of you have been challenged by families and loved ones who have been ill, and others are facing severe impacts economically from the results of this terrible virus. Please know that our thoughts and prayers are with you all, and whilst St Hugh's here is battling through it too, we are confident we'll get through this, and the support of our alumni has been magnificent. Thank you so much for those of you who have supported our COVID fundraiser to help the college as well. But if any of you need support from us, please don't hesitate to ask us for that. There are people around the world. We have an amazing network of over 7,000 people, and hopefully we'll be able to get assistance to you if required. It's my very great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Michael McMahon. Michael is a professor of economics at the university here, and after many years of dedicated service to this college as a tutorial fellow, I was also thrilled to hear that he had been appointed to a research fellowship in the department. And following that, he's also been appointed as a senior research fellow at St Hugh's College because we simply didn't want to lose him. I hope that you took the opportunity to read his CV, which you'll see is stellar. He is an amazing teacher. Our students love his lectures, and I'm sure you will be highly entertained, notwithstanding the rather bleak nature of its title. And I hope that somewhere in there there'll be some cheery news for us. We have been absolutely inundated with questions for Michael, and so he's tried to incorporate at least 40 of those into his presentation, and I know that there are some others which we may have later on. So without further ado, may I introduce you to Professor Michael McMahon, who's going to speak about economics and COVID.
Thank you very much, Principal. Hopefully, even though we can't physically be together, I hope my backdrop, at least temporarily, gives those of you who are also away from college a chance to reminisce of where we could all be, and hopefully not too long will be again. I'm going to share my slides, so hopefully you can see those. The one disclaimer that I have to give before I start, as well as my academic post, I actually am a member of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, and I must state that everything I'm saying now, which actually is going to touch on some of the issues pertinent to my work advising the Irish government, that the views I'm expressing here are mine alone, and not necessarily those of the Irish government, the Fiscal Council, or anyone else. Okay, good. As I have a line here on what I would have talked about is above the line. What I've added is my response to the 40 or so questions which came in. I have to admit I was slightly overwhelmed. I had suggested to Bruce and Catherine and Tom that maybe if we just see if anybody has anything they particularly would like me to talk about, and I thought maybe one or two people would throw something into the mix, but I got lots of questions, and they do all relate to economics, not all to the area of economics that I specialize in, but given we have such a broad sort of multidisciplinary crowd, I thought I could at least say something. So what I'll do is I'll start by talking about, as Ailish said, you know, the sort of the slightly depressing stuff, talking about where we are economically in terms of the impact of COVID-19, and in particular the effects that it might be expected to have going forward. And a big part of that is going to be the policy response. And so when thinking about the policy response, I will try particularly to split it up among the two main macroeconomic policies, monetary and fiscal policy, but really focus on the big question, which lots of people rightly have on their mind: how are we going to pay for what are essentially unprecedented levels of support that most, at least advanced economy governments have been providing during the last few months? I then got some questions on the labour market, the specifics of the education sector, questions about a green recovery, a field which actually I did know about a little bit, but which has of course grown a lot, which is called epi-econ, the sort of merging of epidemiology and economics. And actually, until last night, I was amazed because Brexit had not come up, and I thought I might get away without having to mention the Great Divider. Most of you will have picked up from which government I'm advising and from my accent that I am Irish. So I'm one of these people who live in the UK but will retain a European passport throughout whatever happens with deals or no deals. But overnight we got 3 or 4 questions on Brexit, so I thought I should at least address the other elephant in the room. And then there are a few others that I will try and get to. I will get to these, but like I say, the majority of my talk will focus on this sort of the macro economic recovery, costs of fiscal and monetary policy part. I will also monitor the Q&A, so probably at the end I'll try and leave 5 or 10 minutes in case questions have come up during the talk, either responses. Like I say, a lot of what I say will come from one particular set of views on how things are playing out. But the reality of the situation right now is that the world is incredibly uncertain. And uncertain in ways that are sort of unprecedented for economists, because the biggest uncertainty relates to health, medical, and the sort of evolution of the pandemic. So in a sense, we are, as everyone else, waiting to see what the developments are going to be. So let me jump straight into the recession and the recovery. Just after I do a small plug, there is a website. It is a UK-based website. It's funded by the UK Research Councils. It's called the Economics Observatory, although the website for now is coronavirusandtheeconomy.com. This is a website where, for all the questions that I don't answer, or for all the things that are outside of my area of expertise, you can go onto this website. There's this section, Answers by Topic, and there are an ever growing series of articles written with the objective being to write them for the layperson, or at least the educated layperson, to be able to understand some of the issues related to these. If there's a question that you have that hasn't been answered either by me or there, you can actually submit your question, and eventually we will get round to answering it. I say we because I will be honest, I am one of the founding editors of this website, and so it didn't exist at all on the 1st of May, and we launched on the 1st of June, but we're fairly happy, at least at the content now, and the more people engage with it, the happier we'll be again. Okay, so here's some of the questions on this topic of recession and recovery. How many years will it take for our economy to recover? Do I believe that countries that handled it well will have an advantage in the medium term? What's the depth, the breadth, and the timing of the recession? Are we entering these sort of volatile, uncertain, ambiguous environment, and what should businesses do to react? Would there be inflation or deflation? Both seem possible. How bad are things going to get? And the question about stock market. And I realized actually just earlier that I probably won't touch on this, but if I get a chance at the end, I'll come back to the markets. So let me start that. So a big question to start with is, was a recession inevitable? And I'm going to say something which I never thought as an economist I would say, and that is, a recession was not just inevitable, it was in fact desirable. So again, we've had the Great Depression. The reference to the financial crisis in economics is often the Great Recession as opposed to depression. And this current slowdown is getting the name either the Great Lockdown or the Great Cessation. So why would I say that a recession is desirable? It seems like the opposite of what you would expect economists to want. Well, the reason is because this is a shock which is medical, and actually the recession is part of the treatment for the public health crisis. And so the idea that if we had chosen not to lock down parts of the economy, that the economy would not have gone into recession is, to me, a nonsense. That sort of trade-off just doesn't exist. I've stolen this chart from original idea came from Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas. And if you look at the red lines, this shows on the top part of the graph how the new cases would evolve. And the red on the bottom is if the new cases evolved according to the red, the economy would evolve according to the red. The blue is a world where you have some containment policies. And again, this is not a quantification of anything, it's just a stylized example. But you can see that even if you take no containment policies, the economy still takes a hit. Now, it's almost certainly true that by taking containment policies, such as lockdown, preventing nightclubs from opening, cinemas, bars, restaurants, etc., the effect on the economy gets somewhat larger. But it's not the case that no containment would have meant no effect on the economy. It is simply the fact that if the economy was allowed to continue operating as normal, as the virus took greater hold, as it has in countries that have had much more relaxed lockdowns, the economy would still be hit. It's just it would be hit because people would choose not to engage in the slightly riskier activities. And so in that sense, a recession was in some ways inevitable, and from the public health point of view was desirable. So how bad is it? Well, economists have had to get a little bit creative. So this is using data, again, taken from an article on the Economic Observatory by Paolo Sirico and some co-authors. This uses data from fintech apps, essentially people tracking your real-time spending, and compares this sort of bluish line is the behavior of average weekly spending, but excluding recurring bills. So in a sense, this is like not your rent, it's not your heating bill, your utility bills, but it's what you spend, say, in the shops on your debit or credit cards. It's what you spend in a pub or cinema, whatever. And you can see that the pattern week by week across 2019 was fairly stable. In fact, slightly growing over time. There are peaks and there are some local troughs, but it's fairly stable. And what you can see for the UK figures for 2020 was that at least the discretionary type spending had already started to slow before any formal measures of lockdown had been implemented. And this goes back to my earlier point. People will not go out and spend in a discretionary fashion. They will not go to nightclubs as much. They will not go to pubs as much in a world where doing that activity is suddenly risky from the point of view of catching COVID-19. And you can see after lockdown, it's true, this spending seemed to fall a bit further. So that was sort of how we were trying to measure things in the early days of lockdown. In fact, just today, we got the first release from the Office for National Statistics of the May 2020 estimate for economic activity. So again, the way we think as economists about economic activity, when people talk about gross domestic product or GDP, what we're thinking about is within a given period, how many goods and services were produced. And this is a level index. So this would say, this would be a measure, an index measure of the amount produced in early 2020 compared to earlier periods. What you can see, and it's really unprecedented, is the speed and severity of the drop in UK GDP has no equivalent, at least in recent history. The global financial crisis, which of course was a really large, certainly the biggest for almost a century recession that the UK faced, fell from an index level of about 92 to about 95. So you're talking about a 7% or 8% fall in economic activity. We have seen over a 20% fall in a matter of a few months related to COVID-19. Now, today's number, which people have been talking about in the news, was that actually relative to April, May is not quite as bad. It grew by 1.8%. 1.8% is actually the strongest growth that we've seen in a given month for quite a long time. Of course, in the context of having fallen by nearly 25%, the 1.8 is a very minor tick up. So it's bad and it remains bad. And I'll come back to this point in a little bit. If you convert that to quarterly numbers, which is the standard way we think about GDP, the 3 months up to May will have fallen by about 20%. Once we get to add June as well, unless there's an absolutely astounding rebound in June, which nobody expects, that quarter will be by far the worst quarter of economic growth in recent times. And for context, in the global financial crisis, at no time did a quarter shrink by more than 2.1%. So we're talking almost 10 times as large an effect in the second quarter of 2020. And again, probably predictable, but it's worth just showing you these numbers. The effect has not been spread evenly across different sectors of the economy. If you're in financial services, the decline is about 2.5%. If you're in public administration and defense, if anything, it's actually grown, the outputs there. If you're in accommodation and food services, the decline is about 72%. Construction is down by about a third. So you can see that the effects of this have been huge and concentrated in particular parts of the economy. The other aspect of inequality in terms of the effects of COVID-19 are that, at least if you look in aggregate, you can see that saving has actually gone up. That's not typical for most recessions, that aggregate savings would rise certainly as much. Now, it's not hard to think why. Those of us who are fortunate enough to be in a job where we have not lost income, and yet we are operating in a world where we can no longer go out and spend the usual amounts we would spend, we would see that our income remains at whatever level it usually is, and our spending goes down, and the gap between that becomes sort of forced saving. One issue with this graph here is that this is the aggregate. So at the aggregate, if you average over all the people in the UK economy, savings have gone up. This is also very unevenly distributed. And one of the big things that determines the distribution of this is actually your existing level of income. And part of that you can see from this chart, which comes from the Resolution Foundation, which basically says, if you're in the 20th, the upper 5% of the UK income distribution, within that set of earners, about half of all the work that those people do can be done from home. Now, this is a combination of what we would call intensive and extensive margins. So there are some people who can do all their work and some who can do none, or most people can do a fraction of their work. The big inequality comes that when you go to the lower paid jobs in the UK, the average is under 10% of their work can be done from home. So the second policies impose you cannot go to the place of work, or you cannot, it's advisable to stay at home, this disproportionately hits those who are already on lower incomes. And so actually, we don't have the official data yet, but all the indications are that the aggregate rise in savings has come from the upper part of the income distribution. So the richer households now have built up extra savings, while the poorer households, rather than just not building up savings, they've actually had to run down savings because they're more likely to have been hit with lower incomes. So again, it's bad and it's unevenly distributed across sectors and across households by income. Okay, and you can see some of this, and this is actually not from the UK, this is Spanish spending data, but you can see that some of the sectors that actually have the highest proportion of lower wage, lower income workers have been the ones that have been hit the most. So the retail sector has largely been hit, apart from food, which is of course as a key sector been kept open. Bars and restaurants have been very badly hit, and of course the travel industry has been largely shut down, at least in the initial part. So there are big inequalities from this. The other bit which I think is interesting, and we haven't done enough research on, but I thought it was interesting enough to tell you about, is this graph. Actually, you can use spending patterns and the geotagging of spending patterns, and this data actually comes from Spain. And the equivalent is Google mobility data, which people have been talking about, but this essentially gives a sense of how much people are moving around. And in Spain, at least at the aggregate level, you can see that that in Spain, people's travel dropped a lot over the lockdown, and as they've eased lockdown, it's gradually risen. You see that equally by measuring how much, and this comes from one of my co-authors on other projects, and his work with Spanish data from BBVA Bank. You can see that spending on transportation has dropped as well, and sort of mimics at least the broad pattern. Because we have daily data, and because they have data by day and by different for different individuals, you can actually look in this right-hand chart and see that of this decline, there is a differential fall again, where it seems like the richest have been able to stay at home, whereas those who are poorer have had to continue, at least to a greater degree, to spend money on transportation. In other words, they still have to go to work because their work can't be done at home. You can see everybody sort of agrees. If you're wondering what these spikes down are, that's the weekend. So everybody kind of complies at the weekend, and it's during the work week that people in the lower, at the bottom decile of income, they end up still traveling a lot more. And what they do in that paper is actually show that this, having to engage with public transportation, actually puts these people at greater risk of falling ill from the pandemic. So I think, it's not just that the effects of COVID are unequal. That inequality and that economic inequality is also potentially feeding back into vulnerability of falling ill during the pandemic. Okay, how bad will it be? Well, I'm going to give the typical answer of an economist and say it will depend. What does it depend on? Well, as restrictions are eased, it will depend on how much income people have lost. Again, there'll be people at the top who haven't lost income and will have built up savings. There'll be people at the bottom who've lost a lot of income and have no saving buffer to fall back on. It will depend what those with savings choose to do with their savings. And I think the biggest uncertainty is what we would call the behavioral reaction. How quickly will people be willing to go back to doing activities that we thought were perfectly normal, going to a restaurant for dinner? How quickly will they feel comfortable doing that? And of course, this is where the interesting interaction with the public health side comes. In a sense, by getting a greater control of the spread of the virus, you are more likely to have consumers who are confident that things are under control and therefore more willing to spend, which will bring you back to a more normal state more quickly. So I think if there's in the question about countries that deal with it better, I do think that the bit where it will kick in is through this behavioral response. But to be honest, at the moment, we don't have great data on that. I'll show you one or two little things in a minute. The other question, which is going to come up when I talk about education and the labor market, is whether what's called long-term scarring. So when I talk about the policy response, I will talk about why you want to take actions that avoid this scarring. It's impossible to avoid all of it. And the extent to which the economy does well going forward after the public health crisis has subsided, at least mostly subsided, or not, will depend on the extent of scarring. And again, it also, as I said, it interacts a lot with policy response, both on the economic side and on the public health side. And the big unknown, and this will come up when I talk about green recovery as well, and maybe a little bit when I talk about Brexit, is what are the longer term consequences of all of this? And I think, there are some potential sort of game changers for how we operate as economies going forward. But again, the key message at this point in time remains, we just don't know. There's huge uncertainty, and there are downside risks to everything. I can always think of how things could be much worse, but equally there are, in this case, I think, upside risks. And I'll try rise to Ailish's challenge of at least having some good news as I talk. Okay, so how bad will it be? I want to stress that these are purely illustrative examples, but I just wanted to make sure we had the right language. So imagine this is gross domestic product. So remember, this is a flow. This is how much is produced in a given period. And this blue line you can think of as how the economy would have behaved absent any sort of COVID-19 event. It would, gradually grow, and over the space of a couple of years would maybe grow 3 or 4%. Again, these exact numbers is a little higher here because I actually originally did these for Ireland, which has a slightly higher growth rate, but ballpark, you think gradual growth, nice, easy, normal times. So now when economists think about this, one really optimistic case, if we want to be completely optimistic, we can have what we call pure intertemporal substitution. What does that mean? Well, it means that, the virus is rampant. The government has told us we can't spend as much money, so we cut our spending, but we just defer all that spending. So we just save it up. And as soon as everything reopens at some point in the summer, we go back and we spend what we would have spent. So we spent about half as much this time, but then we spend double the next time, and then we go back to where we were. That is by far the most optimistic, and I think completely unrealistic. But it's there if we want to think about an optimistic type world. The other alternative is slightly less optimistic, but still optimistic. And you will have heard discussion of this if you read economic articles in the press, The Economist, FT, etc. And that's the idea of a sort of V-shaped recovery. So what does the V-shape mean? It means that everything that went on in this period is lost. I didn't go to the restaurant, I saved the money, and I'm not going to go to the restaurant extra when I can, but I go back to doing everything completely normally. So we sort of drop, we come pretty quickly back up, and this thing looks like a V or a sort of U as I've drawn it here. Again, as we go through time, we'll learn a little bit more as to whether we look V-ish or it's going to be more like a U, but we eventually go straight back to what we would have been doing anyway. A slightly more pessimistic view, sometimes, again, not to advertise for American sportswear company, but sometimes called the swoosh, I'll jump onto that here, is one where we drop and then we very gradually go back. Here you could imagine that behaviorally, even though the restaurants are open, I'm a little worried about going just yet, and I maybe spend a little bit extra, or maybe I'll get, I'll go to one restaurant that I think is dealing with it better, but another I won't, or I'll go to restaurants, I won't go to pubs, or, you can imagine people making their own choices, and we get this kind of swoosh, gradual recovery back. And then the final sort of more pessimistic one is, it looks a bit like the swoosh, but we never get back to where we were. So there's this permanent gap throughout 2021, and we can imagine this persisting just throughout the rest of time, where nobody ever sort of goes back to the old level. The old growth rates, yes, but the old levels, no. So there are certain things that we just stop doing, or because we're worried about the fact that there's a second or third or fourth wave, or there's COVID-22 or 23, we start deciding we need to protect ourselves a bit, and we start building up more saving, which just means every period we're less willing to consume as much. Or you could imagine there are certain industries that have existed and thrived up until now that just can no longer live in a world of nervousness or social distancing or whatever. So, put them all together, there's a whole mix of things. I don't think the yellow is very likely. I'm pretty certain we're not going to get the V shape, at least in the sense that people thought it would be an immediate V. Whether it becomes a U, we'll find out in time. If I had to be pushed, I think we will get to somewhere between the green and the gray line. So I think there will be some permanent loss. I don't think it will be as big as I've drawn it in this chart, which is about sort of 15%. But there'll be some essentially permanent gap that will always live on. Again, How much weight would I put on that being correct? Honestly, not that much, because we have just no idea at this moment how long even the health crisis will go on. I hope, you know, economists are often accused of spurious accuracy, and I want to make sure I drive home, if nothing else, that there's a huge amount of uncertainty here. Okay, so let me just show you one bit of optimism. Here's again that data from Spain. Now, Spain's interesting because Spain, of course, had a very bad impact of the pandemic early, but that impact sort of subsided. They got control of it relatively quickly, and they've now, and their lockdown was incredibly strict. You know, police on the street checking your bag to make sure that you had actually gone to the shop you said you went to and you weren't just getting out for a walk or whatever. And they've been able to lift lockdown, and they've done it in a number of stages. Indicated the orange is when they imposed lockdown, and the subsequent colored lines indicate different degrees of easing lockdown. And you can see that aggregate expenditure, which had fallen according to the BBVA data by about 65% in lockdown, has actually come back and recovered to just under, not even as bad as 10% less relative to before lockdown. So again, there's some optimism that if you get control of the virus, or are perceived to get relative control of the virus, that you can bounce back at least most of the way. Okay, one question that came up is, should we expect to see inflation or deflation? Well, another question is, how do you even measure inflation? During, you know, the usual way we measure inflation is to check the prices of a series of goods that have been sort of predefined. During the lockdown, it's impossible to actually measure some of the goods because they are no longer traded. You know, a pint of bitter in a particular pub in Oxford has not been available for large parts of the lockdown, and therefore the price, do you measure that price as infinity? It's impossible to get, or do you measure it as zero? So even measuring inflation is hard during the lockdown. But post-lockdown, there are two schools of thought. One is, inflation is not going to become a problem. Even if it becomes a problem, we can take action then. If anything, we want to worry about deflation, and therefore, you know, just ignore that. It's the downside that matters. So this number one would say deflation is the more likely. Let's you know, support the economy as much as we can. There is I would say a minority view still, but that, you know, the extent of expansionary monetary and fiscal policies, together with the hits to the supply side of the economy. So, you know, it's difficult now for firms to produce under social distancing. It's more difficult for restaurants to make a profit at their old prices. They're going to have to drive up prices. And so they would say, actually, we're standing on the precipice of a kind of a surge in inflation. And both, I think, have some, you know, I can see as both as being possible. I certainly, for now at least, fall in camp one. I just don't see high inflation either being the main enemy, nor being that likely. So, and I think if I look at this is the market long-term 10-year government bond yields for the UK, and you can see they've just tracked down, and they're even at their historic lows at the moment, which basically captures part of the market's view of what inflation is likely to be. And so I think for now, I fall on the inflation is not very likely. I would worry more about deflation, and so therefore stimulus is sort of desirable. But again, I don't want to suggest that that's a 100% likely view. I just also think that when we see inflationary pressures come, and we've been essentially under inflation targets for quite a while, building up some inflation wouldn't actually be the worst thing, so long as we don't let it get too out of control. Okay, now policy response. Let me do about 10 minutes on this, and then race through some of the other important questions. A lot of questions here. You know, unprecedented support. How do we deal with it? National debt is piling up. Can we just give out money to anyone who needs it? How secure are pensions in an economy that's overstretched? You know, should we have wealth taxes? Well, how do we deal with the intergenerational inequality? You know, should pensioners be pushed to dip into their pension pots and borrow against them, or use it to support the economy? And then some other questions which I think are great and you could talk about for a long, long time. And I'll talk a little bit about job creation and selected targeted schemes at certain sectors, but also, you know, how do we do large scale policy intervention in a world of radical uncertainty? I mean, I think that's sort of huge when I really won't have time to cover that now. Will there be radical change? Okay, I'll try and come to those by the end. Okay, so what should policymakers do? Well, monetary policymakers have supported the financial sector. The last thing we want during a pandemic is also to have a financial disruption. We've seen in the global financial crisis that has been an issue. But again, the financial sector entered this recession, desirable as it may be, in a relatively healthy state. And monetary conditions remain incredibly favorable. As I showed, the interest rates are at historical lows. And actually central banks have generally expanded their asset purchase programs, which provide support both for government, so quantitative easing, purchasing of government bonds, makes it easier for the government to fund its support, but also for the private sector, which is increasingly benefiting from central bank policy. So in a way, monetary policy is doing a lot, providing a lot of support, but in many ways is sort of tapped out. Interest rates are already at historic lows. There's not much more they can do on that. They can push a little bit more on QE, but ever since the global financial crisis, monetary policy has shouldered much of the burden. So my view is that this is the recession where fiscal policy needs to play an important part. And again, I think this is fiscal policy's whatever it takes moment. I think, you know, at least in the early parts, the right priorities were to support the health sector, fight the virus, protect life, support individuals, both directly in terms of how their income can be protected, or how they can be protected from, say, missing payments on loans, but also to support them indirectly through the employers. You know, once the health crisis subsides, we need to make sure there are firms to re-employ people. If we allow all the firms to sort of go to the wall, it's going to be very difficult to get the economy going again as you wait for new firms to come in and take the place of those firms that have been lost. What's the implication of this? Well, it means revenue goes down because, you know, there's less spending, there's less VAT, there's less income tax for people who've lost their job, and expenditure goes up, and potentially way up, which means the deficit should grow and probably very large. The key point is that this should be viewed as temporary. Now, economists have a bad name generally for always pushing for fiscal sustainability. Now, when I got appointed to the Fiscal Council, one of the main Irish newspapers, they called me a deficit-friendly economist. I want to just sort of be clear. I don't actually consider myself as particularly deficit-friendly. I think the key point is that discipline, fiscal discipline, is necessary most of the time because it buys you the freedom to act when necessary. So that's my first thing, right? Why should we be bold? Why should we use fiscal policy? Interest rates are incredibly low. And if we don't do it, the economy collapses, and that's even worse. So this is exactly why you have, you know, you don't have a rainy day fund and then lock it away when it starts raining. So you build in that space so that you can act. And then the other question, how do we prevent the intergenerational aspects of this? Well, I have a view that if you have an event that's a sort of once in 100 years event, the best way to pay for it is over 100 years. And again, debt provides the ability to do that. You borrow now and you gradually pay this down. You do not borrow now and then next year jack up taxes just as the economy is trying to recover, jack up tax rates, trying to recover the money that was spent in the pandemic. So I very much support a strong fiscal response and debts. That does not mean we don't have to worry about debt. After the crisis, immediate health crisis, we'll have to provide extra stimulus in the traditional sense. I think the health stuff is the stuff we're doing at the moment. You know, furlough schemes, etc., are not standard for economic recessions. But, you know, what you want to do is boost growth because that reduces the burden of your debt. But further down the road, and I'll come on to these in a little bit, we're going to see big challenges, big challenges that we will have to deal with, and they will require some tough choices to be made by governments about what they want to spend on and how they want to raise funds to pay for that. So one idea, again, on the Fiscal Council, we're very careful. These are political choices, so we're very careful never to give specific advice on policies. But you can think about potentially there being an intergenerational effect of this crisis. You will talk about it in the labour market section next. But you can imagine that those who already have jobs, essentially those who are typically that bit older, haven't been as badly affected by this as those who are younger, have recently entered the labour market or are about to enter the labour market. And what we don't want to do is put the burden both of the costs right now on the younger generations and then burden them with paying for it. So wealth taxes, inheritance taxes are things which I certainly think should be pursued, but ultimately these are political choices as to how the burden of this is spread. Okay. Can't we just print the money? So MMT is an idea which has become a bit popular, at least in some circles at the moment. It stands for modern monetary theory, and it suggests that surely if we are sovereign producers of our own, suppliers of our own currency, we can simply print the money and then, you know, stop printing it once inflation becomes a problem. I would say that most economists, certainly conventional economists, are pretty much against it. There have been enough attempts in history to sort of do this, and you know, to do something irresponsible, but to say you're going to do an irresponsible thing, but very carefully, I'm not sure I buy. There's a quote here about inflation, because essentially that's what it leads to. Inflation is one form of taxation that can be imposed without legislation. This is a quote from an interview with Milton Friedman, the famous economist, in The Guardian. An interview, a really wonderful interview with Francis Cairncross. So, you know, it's a form of taxation that is particularly seductive. It's attractive, right? You print, you get some inflation. At first, it's not so bad. But eventually, when the dynamics of inflation get very bad, and you know, many countries, even quite recently, and I spoke about this last time I did a talk for St. Hugh's, talking about Zimbabwe, you know, hyperinflation is incredibly damaging, and I'm not suggesting the UK is anywhere close to hyperinflation, but even high inflation can be very damaging, and so I think we've built up a set of institutions that are pretty good at dealing with inflation and separating responsibility for inflation from the direct managing of the economy, and I would be loath, at least yet, to see those broken down. There is on the Economic Observatory website a long article, well, 1,800-word article, which I've written trying to expand on those views a little bit more. So if anyone's particularly interested, you can see it there, or get in touch with me and I can send it to you. Okay, now we're into the parts which I wasn't going to talk about, but I still have 15 minutes, so I will. So here are the questions. So I don't really have a lot of evidence. These came in the last few days, so this is not my area, so I haven't formed new research on these, but I'll give at least my views on this. I'd be interested to hear about any long-term effects the pandemic has on the job market for young people. What's the advice for young people graduating? You know, what's the impact of the pivot to virtual or digital in companies? And, you know, how can we ensure new jobs are created fast enough to support those whose jobs will be lost forever as a result of COVID? Well, I think the last one we can't. So we know unemployment will go up. The question is, as we recover, can we replace or reallocate labor to sectors that are growing? And I've sort of already touched on this. This pivot to virtual or digital, like I say, it has favored certain jobs, certain sectors. And in particular, those tend to be the better paid jobs. So this is one place where the inequality is really coming through. And for young people entering the job market, I mean, the concept which I talk about on this next slide is actually a concept called scarring, which I will mention in just a moment. But I guess one thing to say is, I've mentioned it a few times, that this is very unusual for its scale of the drop in economic activity, but also the speed with which it has dropped. And that's largely because this is an economic shock that certainly in the UK we haven't seen for a long time, this type of shock. And hopefully this is a temporary shift in the mix of economic activities, right? So, you know, we've gone from going to the pub to meeting friends on Zoom and having drinks via Zoom. But then the question is, can we reallocate workers? And this sort of goes to that last point, last question. It's very difficult because a lot of these jobs that are become more pertinent in a sort of COVID-19 world are not easy to transition into if you have previously been working as a waiter or waitress in a restaurant to suddenly become tech support for Zoom calls. And so there is a sort of burden, and I'll talk about this in the next slide about education, or the next section about education, you know, to think a little bit about if there are sectors which we genuinely lose, how do we retrain without having sort of a permanent effect on long-term unemployed? Because a lot of the sectors that are being badly affected, or we think might be permanently affected, are ones in which young people are particularly heavily employed. And so the idea of having young people who might be 25 and they're going to be long-term unemployed for 40 seems like an absolutely terrible waste of potential labor in the economy and just human life in terms of all the psychological effects that go with being employed, positive psychological effects of being employed. So typically though, in recessions, we see a thing called scarring. So in other words, and the evidence varies a little bit on this, but at least for 10 years and potentially permanently, entering the job market during a recession, so graduating from high school, graduating from university, has an effect on the income you earn going forward at least 10 years. Some studies say it kind of has dissipated after 10 years. Others find evidence that it's still there after 30 or 40 years. So they're typical. Now, I'm particularly worried with this one because I do think there are interpersonal aspects of jobs that just can't be translated. Even if you have a job like I'm very fortunate to have, where I can do most of my interactions via Zoom or Teams or Skype or whatever it is, I do worry that some of the interactions can't happen, at least in the same way, or the sort of human capital I would build up or the interpersonal relationships that I would develop can't build up as easily in a world of social distancing where I have to meet my new colleagues via Zoom calls. And so that's a worry which might suggest it's going to be worse. As I said, hopefully if things go back to normal pretty quickly, then we will not have this sort of permanent effect, and maybe we get back and this is all just a distant memory. I would love if that were the case. The other thing I worry about a lot is that this sort of issue would possibly exacerbate existing inequalities. So for example, it's you know, if I think about my kids, you know, if they're not quite old enough now to enter the job market, but if they did, you know, they would have at home computers and, you know, good internet connection so that they could start a job while being, you know, stuck at home with mum and dad. You can imagine if you come from a sort of poor background or in a household that nobody else has been to university before, you don't have computers in the house, you don't have good internet connection. Suddenly starting a new job, it's harder for you to even be part of that position, that role, because of your existing situation. And I do worry a lot about that, both when it comes to the labor market, and we've worried a lot about it in the last few months when thinking about how we can take our teaching and our sort of our role of you know, educating students at St. Hugh's and make it so that they can get a sort of a full education, even though the last term has been socially distanced. Okay. What policies might help? Well, in '98, there was a New Deal for young people, which involved young people who are unemployed getting options to do training or taking sort of partial training, partial working, and different options. One option is we go for a new version of that, so a new Deal. And the other idea is, you know, greater support for apprenticeships and guarantees for apprenticeship schemes, placement schemes, policies that are targeted at firms hiring young workers. So not just national insurance, but national insurance for low-wage jobs, because low-wage jobs tend to be the ones young workers take, and they also tend to be the ones that newly employed workers from the unemployment pool take. So we want to make sure we don't leave people in the unemployment pool for too long. because there is a lot of evidence that staying in the unemployment pool actually makes it more likely that you never get out. That's a thing called hysteresis. Another thing that's been suggested is there had been a review and a suggestion that the full minimum wage, which currently comes only at 25, should be brought in at from 21 on. And one idea is that until there's a recovery, we postpone that increase because we make it more attractive to hire younger workers. Okay, quickly on to the last few topics. Education. I mean, obviously, I assume some of my colleagues submitted these, but also interested alum. You know, I think we've been dealing a lot with how we can try and ensure that the learning activities, the learning environment can stay as normal as possible. But one question, and this relates to my point about interpersonal relationships, the social skills that come from, you know, doing socially distanced learning is a concern. And it hasn't been such a bad issue so far because, you know, we've had, say, first year or second year students that already had interpersonal relationships. So when they saw each other on a screen, they knew who they were, they'd hung out together or whatever. But in theory, you know, we could have socially distanced first year students if things get bad again. It's not the intention, but if things got bad again and we had to move to a Michaelmas term of online, we would have students meeting over Zoom for the first time. And I think, you know, that would make the development of these interpersonal skills and relationships much more difficult. You know, the sector as a go-to sector for cuts, obviously, I think that's something I worry about a lot. In particular, you know, how do, you know, places like Oxford and Cambridge, where in a sense the unique selling point is the close community, the small groups, the tutorials, but it's actually a relatively expensive way of teaching. So it is quite a difficult thing for even places like Oxford and Cambridge to make sure that the model remains viable and that the delivery of the education remains at the high level that we sort of come to expect. But equally, that can be said about other aspects. You know, so as I mentioned, apprenticeships, other retraining, I think are very important. And this issue of scientific funding. Well, actually, I think scientific funding is a concern. I actually think this is more of a concern when it comes to Brexit. So I'll mention that in a moment. Okay, speedily jumping through. Gosh, I'm not as fast as I always knew this. I'm never as fast at lectures as I think. Okay, what opportunities for creating a zero carbon economy by 2050, or is it a lost cause? You know, does this help or does it hinder our climate goals? I don't know. There's some interesting articles on the Economic Observatory website. I don't know. Let me offer just a few thoughts. Obviously, there are some direct effects that have been beneficial. Less commuting, less business travel, less office use. Offices tend to be air conditioned. You know, anti-globalization steps, which may be bad for the economy, but, you know, may ultimately, if we encourage more production at home, if we build up localized supply chains, we just permanently build in less, you know, fossil fuel usage or pollution. These are potentially big long-term beneficial aspects. It's also potentially a chance to change course, which I think the questions were getting at, both because, you know, interest rates are low, but also, as Ailish knows very well, you know, I sit on the college's investment committee, and there is an attractiveness of green investments. They've been attractive to our student body for a long time, but actually, I think we've all come around to the idea that actually in the world going forward, companies that are actively addressing issues related to climate challenges are going to be more profitable going forward as governments get more and more serious about addressing this. And I would certainly hope that they don't become less serious as a result of COVID-19. But, and this relates to another point I'll make later, a lot of the climate stuff does somehow rely on international cooperation. And I think that is becoming somewhat strained at the moment, at least between some of the largest countries in the world. So that's a kind of worrying place to be, but hopefully we get through that and we continue on a course to moving towards a more climate friendly economic environment. Epi-econ, this is a new field. I'm not part of it, but I hopefully have touched on this idea of the interaction between health and the economy, and this idea that it's not a one-way street, that the shutdown kills the economy but helps the health side. I do think that people will respond, and I think that's where the economists come in. We do think a lot about how behavioral responses will react to the environment that they're in. I think there are huge questions about how both the first wave, but also if there's second or even third waves, how they affect ongoing treatment of people. The health economics of this is important. And again, I refer anyone who's interested to the website to talk about it. There's some nice articles by some experts in both epi-econ and health economics. The one I didn't want to talk about. So these 4 questions all came in the last 24 hours. So I figure I would mention them a little bit. They all relate to the same thing. I saw this chart, I saw it on Reddit. It's a kind of nice chart, I think captures the last few points. So we have a big negative wave coming in. Then we have a Brexit wave and a climate change wave. I don't think I agree with the scale of these. I think the climate change one is probably in the right size. The Brexit one, I'm not sure about. So let me talk about it in the Irish context. Ireland being the country outside of the country remaining in the EU that's most affected by Brexit. I think it'll be a negative effect if there's a no-deal Brexit. Certainly a negative effect on Ireland. Is it worse because of COVID-19, or is it less bad? I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because, for example, one concern was Ireland would lose tourism. Well, Ireland's already lost tourism. Telling everybody they have to isolate for 2 weeks essentially rules out tourism in Ireland at the moment. So if no deal Brexit happens, and therefore we would have lost a lot of tourists, but they're already not coming, the additional impact of Brexit is somewhat lower. Of course, what you don't want is the economy to start recovering a little bit from the COVID-19 shock and then hit it with another shock of Brexit. So I certainly would hope that a deal gets struck, although I have to admit my level of optimism is low. And it relates partly, will economists, politicians, and other interested parties be able to distinguish between COVID-19 costs and the Brexit-induced costs? The answer is it really depends on the timing, but probably no. If the COVID effects are still dragging out, we won't be able to measure exactly what was COVID and what was Brexit, except in a few specific situations. Okay, last set of questions. I got 3 sets, which I'll just really quickly run through, because most of them I have, sadly, nothing interesting to say. Would I invest in commercial property or residential property? Commercial property, I spoke to someone at the weekend about it, and they work for a company that does invest in commercial property, and they remain relatively optimistic. I don't invest in any commercial property myself. It probably isn't surprising to hear. But I guess I'm very uncertain on both commercial and residential property, but particularly commercial. I can see this move away from offices, but then at the other side of things, I can imagine a world where after a year, we all desperately want to get back into our offices, and maybe the effect is not as large. Was there any good research done on the economic impact of the Spanish flu? Yes, there's a wonderful article on the Economic Observatory website. So I suggest people go there. Essentially, it tells you what happened, but also says, be careful extrapolating, because the economy 100 years ago was very different to today. My views, or any other economist's views on the exchange rate? Well, economists are awful at predicting exchange rates. So I think, again, Brexit, I think, has had the bigger effect on the value of sterling than particularly the COVID-19, which is affecting everyone. Going forward, it'll depend a little bit on which economies start recovering sooner and interest rates start rising sooner. But again, I don't have very strong views on that. Farming, I know very little about farming, and I've tried to touch on a little bit this idea of developing supply chains. But I think this point raised in this question, which is, I'll make these slides available so people can read the questions more fully and think about them themselves. But this idea of providing healthy food that's not too expensive, because this is one of the big issues. There's this concept of food deserts, where particularly in low-income areas, the only food you can get is relatively low quality and not healthy, but it is cheap. And again, it's this balancing of, we want people to have healthy food, but we can't have them, you know, having to pay for organic vegetables, which would blow their budget when they can get much more calories, but in a less healthy form. So I think I'm sure strategies that can be developed on that, but they're not my area. US shift away from employer-provided healthcare. I'm always struck when it comes to healthcare. If you ask people in the UK, they would say, I want a system that has no waiting lists. If you ask them to pay like they pay in other parts of the world, like Singapore or the US, where they have no waiting lists or small waiting lists, they would think you're insane. If you go to the US, they'd like it to be cheaper. But if you ask them to put up with the waiting lists, they would again think you're insane. So again, I don't know what the future is. I'm certainly not an expert on the healthcare systems, but it does seem like these are choices that people make. Whether there is a better middle ground, I'm sure there is. Whether it can be politically attained, I'm not sure. And then I think this is my last question. Yeah. I'm based in southern Madagascar. The economic impact here is likely to be devastating, entailing much greater loss of life. People seem reluctant to talk about it. What's my views on the impact in developing economies? I think that's absolutely right, that the effects are going to be larger. I mean, lower income countries. I mean, one thing we should, of course, know, this virus has no sense of respect for borders. And so, you know, countries have shut down borders to prevent new cases coming in, and that has helped. And certainly places like New Zealand seem to have done quite well. But when it comes to poorer countries, lower income countries, they tend to be countries in which there is a less advanced health system, which makes it harder to deal with. There tends to be less safety nets, which mean people, when they fall ill, will still go to work. And there tends to be higher density living. So all of which contribute to bigger, deeper effects of this. And as I said before, dealing with that requires international cooperation. And one of the negative sides of this crisis has been people have become more domestic focused and less thinking about the wider populace of the world. So, okay. I'll leave that up there as my plug. Sorry I went 3 minutes over. There were two questions, if I can just take a second to touch on those. There were two questions which came in. One is, can I send this presentation to my grandson? I will make sure the development office have a copy of it, and you can send it to whoever you want. And another one was about the relationship between GDP and welfare. And what's the overall impact and other things. Well, so this is Ruth's question. Ruth, thanks for your question. It was, I think you're right. You know, you know, not commuting, spending more time at home has big beneficial effects. A lot of people who spend the time that they would have commuted are going out, doing healthy things or walking. Hopefully some of those can be maintained going forward. But I think you're right that overall the effect on welfare is negative, especially because there's big non-linearities in that effect. So, you know, losing your job is really about the worst normal thing that can happen to you in your life in terms of happiness and welfare. So, and it's very, you know, again, safety nets are why we have safety nets to try and prevent the sort of really disastrous collapse in welfare by ensuring you can at least get certain minimum levels of food. And that's one reason why the public support for the economy has been so important at this time. Right, let me stop there.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Michael. It was just absolutely fantastic. As expected, a tour de force, and I'm sure our alumni out there very much appreciate the work that you put into that, and also just the sheer magnetism of the presentation. I have to say that your cheery delivery certainly made it sound better, and I live in hope as an optimist that we will all get through this somehow and that things will be better in the future. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, particularly for doing this during your summer vacation, which is very, very hard earned. And I would like to say to all of you out there, please come back to college. You are, it's like Hotel California, for those of you who know, you check out anytime you like, you never leave us. You're part of our family. We would love to see you when you come back. We will have lots of events, virtual and otherwise, we hope next year. In the meantime, we hope to have another lecture of this nature in September. I hope you all have a wonderful summer, that your families stay healthy and well, and our thoughts remain with you all. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks again to you, Michael.
Thank you.